Hey, Graham, Tommy here. Thanks for your work in week 6. I got some good stuff, I think, in both parts in Forum 1. And I'm glad that for you, there are ways to hold together sort of the personal or psychological on the one hand and the social on the other, whereas these have often been seen one without the other, one at the expense of the other. And for me, um, Paul's not just being autobiographical. I agree that the first person singular I is more than just Paul's own personal peculiar experience. Instead, I think that the I captures what you might call the subjectivity of the human in response to the law's commands, specifically under the power of sin. And it's the sort of way that the person who receives the command experiences the law in their inner life that exposes both the goodness of God's law and the fact that there is a kind of alien power, you might say, that is operating between the person and the law, this power of sin. Obviously, there's a lot more that could be said about what the law does, but this is what Paul wants to emphasize at this stage in the argument, I think, to accentuate for the audience how the work of God in Christ must affect how they relate to the law and how they understand the powers that are at work in the human made of flesh, so that the law will not be a sort of hindrance to their fulfilling it by using it as a measure to boast, to judge hypocritically, but instead the law can be the guide which, when walking by the Spirit, can be fulfilled in the way people love one another. Something along those lines. Anyway, so that to me, I'm glad you're trying to hold together the psychological and the social, and the way those intertwine, I think, really comes through in chapter 8 when walking by the Spirit versus walking according to the flesh plays out very differently in terms of the dynamics of relationship between people, as well as the inner life of people too. Then in Forum 2, you raised some good questions, and I kind of agree that Tim's sort of presses the marriage analogy to deliver more than it needs to in Romans 7, 1-6. I think it is an analogy that's very loose in some ways and comes across as a bit muddled in the flow of Paul's argument, but it can serve its purpose insofar as it communicates the change of relation that the audience, as part of the human, has undergone from being married, you might say, only to Adam, to being married to the Messiah, who died the death of Adam and conveys freedom to the human in a relation to the law that has been freed from the power of sin. So that's kind of how I'd make sense of what he's doing with that marriage analogy. And I think that you're right that Tim's perhaps asks more of it than needs to be asked of it. I'm really sympathetic with the last question you asked here about verses 8 and 9, because I think that it's a case of Paul's using terms really dynamically, so that it's hard for us to square how he uses them in one place with how he uses them in another. So the way he talks about being sin itself being dead and then coming alive in a way through the law, and how the I was alive without the law, that's really hard to map on to the sort of picture that Paul has laid out in chapter 5, 12 to 21. So here's how I would make sense of it. I think that Paul is sort of playing with these terms, life and death, and he's speaking of them in a relative sense. And it has to do with sort of how power is flowing through the human. So the claim is that there's something that happened with the introduction of the law into the drama of the human that has affected how the human relates to sin. Sin, I think he is saying, sort of did not have a certain kind of traction, let's say, in the life of the human without the law. Its power could not be measured. It was more amorphous, but then it sort of acquired a life, even a personality, a pattern in relation to the law. And so it's not that, sin was altogether dead or absolutely dead and non-existent. It's that sin acquired a certain kind of dynamic or pattern in relation to the law when it was given to Adam and then later to Israel through Moses. Similarly, the eye being alive without the law is that I don't think, again, is in utter contradiction, at least to what he says earlier in chapter 5, where you're right, that dead continued to spread anyway, even where there wasn't law. But here, the point is more to do with that subjectivity of the eye. When the eye is relatively oblivious to the command, to the sort of conflict that the command points to or signals in the subjectivity of the human under the law, we might say that the eye experiences a certain kind of life. Not that death is not ruling, but that the subjectivity of the eye is sort of not, we could even say, and again, in a relative sense, sort of freed from that sort of drama of living under the command. And so there's a sense in which there was a relative life present without the command that then turns into death when the law starts measuring the power of sin in the sort of subjectivity of the human. Broadly, that's how I try to make sense of it. But it's a case of something that I think occurs throughout Romans as well as in Paul's other letters, and that is that Paul is content to use language that is very oriented to his rhetorical purposes at a certain stage or point in a letter. And he doesn't always use language in a way that is sort of flat and super consistent in terms of what it means in every single moment or stage of a letter. And in this case, I'd say the way he's using life and death is relative and subordinate to the way he's introduced those key terms at the end of chapter 5. Hope that helps, Graham. Thanks again for some thoughtful responses.